Hello, everyone. Welcome to MSAA's live webinar, Enjoy the Beat. During this hour presentation, guided by Dr. Augusto Miravalle and guest speaker Brittany Quiroz, a hot MS, we will learn more about music, brain health, and the health benefits of music in the MS experience. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. My name is Jahaira Rivera, and I'm the Director of Mission Delivery and Program Development for MSAA and your host. In case this is the first time you're joining one of our programs, I would like to share some information about MSAA and review some housekeeping items. MSAA is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to improving lives today through vital services and support for the MS community. Our initiatives are designed to advance educational, wellness, and supportive resources. Our free programs or services include a national helpline, equipment and cooling distribution program, educational programs, award-winning publications, shared management tools, peer-to-peer online forum, and more. For more information about our programs and services, please visit our website, mymsaa.org. During tonight's program, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions by using the Q&A chat box. As time permits, we will address some of those questions during the Q&A portion of tonight's webinar. Also, please know that the program is being recorded and will be available as an on-demand video on our MSAA's video library within the next couple of weeks. Finally, at the end of the program, we ask that you please complete a brief survey. Your feedback is extremely important, and it helps us develop future content and programs. A link to the survey will also be included in the chat box. And now a friendly reminder, this program is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute formal recommendations. Please speak with your doctor or healthcare provider team if you have specific questions or concerns. And now I am happy and pleased to introduce our guest speakers for this evening. We are excited to have Dr. Augusto Miravalle. He's the chief of the MS and Neuroimmunology Division, as well as Associate Professor of Neurology at Rush University in Chicago. Dr. Miravalle is a board-certified neurologist and MS specialist who has been involved in both clinical and science-based research in the fields of multiple sclerosis and neuroimmunology. He's a member of many professional societies and advisory boards, including MSAA's Hispanic Latinx Advisory Board and Healthcare Advisory Council. Also joining us tonight, Brittany Quiroz, known as a hot MS. She's an MS advocate, motivational speaker, recording artist, and entrepreneur. After her MS diagnosis in 2019, Brittany Quiroz created a hot MS to help change the perfection of what disability looks like. She utilizes her ability to be transparent about her disease and her talents as a writer, speaker, artist, singer, songwriter, and content creator to advocate and bring love and acceptance to others living with multiple sclerosis. Having grown up as a singer and songwriter, Quiroz knew that music would always be a part of her life and is now a crucial part of her MS experience. Welcome, Brittany and Dr. Miravalle. We're so happy that you're joining us tonight. And I will pass it now to Dr. Miravalle.
Thank you, Jahaira. It's a true pleasure being here. And it's great also sharing the stage with Brittany. I cannot wait to be able to listen to your story and get inspired by that. And I just would like to thank MSAA for having this wonderful idea of including this very important topic, which has to do with music and brain health. One that is very rarely discussed, but is something that I think we all can relate, whether it's personally or professionally, of the importance and relevance of music in our lives. So I'd like to thank the MSAA on behalf of myself and everyone involved in this important field. So without further ado, let's just start reviewing some of the science behind how music impacts brain health. And before doing that, I thought to start with a quote from Plato that said, I would teach children music, physics, and philosophy, But most importantly, music, or the patterns in music of all the arts are the keys to learning. So he understood very early on that music is one of those powerful influences to the brain to allow the brain to learn. And brain health is something that is relatively new. We started talking about brain health, I would say, probably a decade ago. And it took many years for the scientific community to come together and even have a definition of brain health. And we finally had a very recent publication by the American Academy of Neurology that gives us this sense that brain health is a continuous state of attaining and maintaining the optimal neurological function of the brain that best supports one's physical, mental, and social well-being through every stage of life. What I like about this definition is that it's not the brain health you ever graduate from. It's not an on and off state that you either lose it or you have it. This is continuous state. It's something that every day we have an opportunity to add points towards our brain health, or conversely, subtract points to the things that we choose to do in our life, the diet that we follow, the exercise, lifestyle interventions, and in the case of today's presentation, it will be music. So I like this because it gives us hope that regardless where you are in your journey, there's always something that you can do to continue to attain and maintain that ultimate function of the brain. Let's go to the next slide. So there are some publications that came recently that actually starts to link the use of music to actual brain health, even though there is a robust amount of literature that discusses the benefits of music in the brain itself, but linking directly to brain health is very recent. And this was a survey done by AARP. And if you look at the numbers, it's already impressive that you can see that 70% of individuals who regularly attend to musical performance rated their brain health as excellent, compared to 52% of individuals that didn't attend to musical performance. This is just attending to a musical performance. The same is true with having exposure to music in your childhood. And 68% of individuals exposed to music as a child had rated excellent, the ability to learn new things. And this doesn't necessarily mean formal training, but it's actually been exposed to music on a regular basis as a kid, compared to 50% of those who were not regularly exposed to music. And then, of course, having an active musical engagement in this survey was associated with higher rates of happiness and good cognitive function. Let's go to the next slide. So what I would like to do today is review some of the anatomical correlations between music and brain health. What are the parts of the brain that get the most benefit from music? And of course, I'm a neurologist. I have to get into the nerdiness of the brain and all these different pathways and functions of the brain because I find it fascinating. But I also want to go more into the practical approach, saying that also discuss the role of music therapy in neurological conditions. Let's go to the next slide. The limbic system is a part of the brain that actually is very primitive and it has many nuclei, and including the thalamus, for example, that is pretty commonly involved in multiple sclerosis. The amygdala is a part of the brain that actually has to do with emotional responses, with fear, for example. The hypothalamus, but most importantly, this part of the brain that we call the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where we store memories. And so our memories are stored in that part of the brain, and it's critical to understand that anything that impacts the hippocampus will have a direct effect with our memories. And something that we didn't know up until a few decades ago is that this part of the brain, we can continue to create new neurons, something we call neurogenesis. So even though we learn in med school that we are born with X number of neurons in the brain and we can't change that, that is no longer true. Parts of the brain, including the hippocampus, we can create new neurons, and that's how we learn. That's how we create new memories. And it's interesting to see that the music, as we'll review in a minute, has a profound direct effect on the hippocampus. Let's go to the next slide. So, and this is just to show you that when you look at evolutionary, how the brain evolved from animals all the way to humans, as you probably know, the humans developed this very impressive cortex, the cortical brain, the rational brain, the brain that allows us to think, to speak the language areas of the brain, to make rational decisions for the most part. But the primitive brain, the limbic brain, is very similar across different species, to the point that when you look at that limbic brain in animals, in dogs, in monkeys, it's very similar, structurally and functionally, to our limbic brain. And that explains how this emotional brain sometimes needs this constant feedback from the cortical or rational brain in order to sometimes suppress certain emotions. And that explains why when we are babies, perhaps, we can't control emotions and babies cry when they get hungry. But then as you get older and you develop more cortical brain, you're able to suppress those those limbic responses, and perhaps you get a little angry when you're hungry, but you don't cry. So that the brain is constantly evolving, and this cortical brain and limbic brain are constantly communicating with each other, trying to influence in a positive and sometimes negative way. Let's go to the next slide. So I thought to create a link between music and the brain by reminding us that there is this triad, these three elements that actually go together in music and brain function. One is the relationship between sound and motion or movement, and also the relationship between sound and emotions. So when the sound gets into our brain, go through the ears and go to the primary auditory cortex. And that primary auditory cortex, which by the way is right next to the hippocampus where we store memories, has a direct relationship and pathways to the frontal lobe, which is the lobe that we use to move. And I think everyone knows this. When you listen to music and you inadvertently start tapping your foot, following the rhythm, that's exactly how this connection happens. You hear something and you feel the need to move or dance into music. And this is an important phenomenon because we can use this correlation to help patients with difficulties with ambulation or gait be able to walk better by using music. The other relationship that is important to remember is the relationship between sound and emotions. And I guess everyone experienced that certain music makes us feel happy or certain music makes us feel sad. And that is also directly linked to the relationship between the primary auditory cortex and the limbic system that controls emotions. So let's go to the next slide. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these concepts because I want to get to the bottom of how music can affect our behavior in the long run. And it's kind of complex to understand, but hopefully I can walk you through the whole process. So these are different neighborhoods in the brain and how the different elements of music are going to affect these different parts of the brain. We spoke about the primary auditory cortex. Everything that comes to the ear from the external stimulation is going to go there for a stop. But then we know that, for example, the rhythm in music will have a profound effect into the frontal lobe. The emotions and pleasure that we get from music will go into the limbic system, but also cognition, which is that prefrontal cortex, the very anterior part of the brain, has a direct correlation with music. And that explains how with music sometimes we get inspired or we start daydreaming or we start thinking about certain things or stories that our brain creates. And that's the relationship between music and this very frontal part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Let's go to the next slide. So, and just to clarify and bring us all up to speed, so these are some of the elements of music. And rhythm we discussed before, that's the duration of sound, and there's a direct relationship between the rhythm that we hear and our ability or wanting to move. Melody, of course, is that coordination of sounds that creates this series of pitches that makes a tune. Harmony is what supports the melody with chords. Then we have the dynamics, the forte, the piano, pianissimo, And that's how loud or soft the music is. And then the timbre will be the different sound quality of the instrument. So all of these factors will be perceived in the brain in different locations and will have a different effect in brain function. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as discussed before, this coupling between what we hear and the movement that our brain wants to do is called the auditory motor coupling. And that follows a very basic principle called the grounding principle. And the grounding principle in music has to do with rhythm creates that framework. If you think about, for example, tennis players, we just finished the French Open, and you see these amazing athletes. And how can they be so coordinated? Because they have lines around this space that creates this sense of a field. And they know that they have to hit the ball in certain areas because they see those lines. Well, rhythm is equivalent to the lines in a tennis court. So rhythm creates this framework, but then the whole music is built around that framework. And if you dissect all the elements of music, rhythm is perhaps the most impactful in our movement or our need to move. And we can use that with another principle called entrainment, that is our need to synchronize with the rhythm that we hear. So naturally, if you hear a certain rhythm and you're moving, you're going to try to match that. And we can use that for individuals, for example, with Parkinson's disease, in which they have slow gait. And we can create music with sequentially faster rhythms to try to help them walk faster. Also, we can do that with individuals, let's say, with a stroke or with multiple sclerosis, that all of a sudden they have weakness in one foot, or they have a foot drop, and they have an asymmetric gait. So with certain rhythms, music therapists and physical therapists can help patients actually try to match the rhythm, in that way bring that gait or the balance of that gait a little bit more rhythmic and more balanced. Let's go to the next slide. So there are now multiple research studies that actually looked at the use of rhythm and music to improve, for example, fine motor control, something that lives in the back of our brain called the cerebellum. And this study looked at individuals, older adults, after 1 year of piano lessons, they had significant improvement, not only in fine motor control, but also cognition. And another study that now nearly a decade ago looked at patients with multiple sclerosis that were able to improve upper mobility and hand function with the use of a musical instrument and a keyboard. Let's go to the next slide. So there is another principle. So we talked about the entrainment, we talked about the grounding, which has to do mostly with rhythm, but now we're going to talk about the ISO principle. And the ISO principle has to do with this coupling between what we hear and our emotions. And the ISO principle says that if we are in a certain state of mind, let's say we've got a long day and we are tired and we are perhaps a little bit depressed and sad, if we get to the car and the first thing that we hear is a very uplifting, fast tune, that music is not going to match where we are, and probably we are not going to enjoy that. Or similarly, if we are very happy and we are having a great day and a great time, and somebody puts a very slow, sad music, that's not going to feel right to us. So that's called the ISO principle, which has to do with music has to match our state of mood. And we can use that for music therapy in different ways. Let's say, for example, a patient with multiple sclerosis has fatigue, which is a very common symptom in MS. And patients describe this lack of energy, that I have difficulty actually getting out of the chair, and I know that I have these things that I want to accomplish, and I don't have the energy. Well, you can use the ISO principle to create a playlist that is going to match where patients are. In that case, it's going to be a song that is slow, and perhaps a little bit of a slow tempo and maybe sad music, and slowly introduce songs in that playlist that gradually are going to bring that tempo and the tone of the song to a faster pace. So hopefully you can bring that state of mood from more of a fatigue state to more of an energized state. Conversely, you can use the ISO principle. Let's say a patient has insomnia and anxiety, and it's difficult for that patient to fall asleep because you're constantly on that high. Or you can use the ISO principle to create the opposite playlist. So basically, we'll be starting with a song that is very fast and gradually bring that tempo of the songs to a slower rate and hopefully helping that patient sleep. So I'm going to pause here for a minute and bring Brittany to the conversation. So Brittany, how's been your experience with music so far?
Oh my goodness. I don't know how to function in the world without being a musician. It's something that's always been in my life. I grew up around musicians. My mother is my music partner and co-writer for over 30 years. Kristen Spath, we are 828 is our band name. But no, I mean, I was always right underneath her piano as an infant, listening to her play. And my grandfather was a big band musician. So it was something that I was always subjected to. And it's so interesting to hear from a scientific and neurological standpoint, the connection between neurology and music, because it is all tied together. And it's something that I think is widely underestimated in terms of the validity that there is such an immense emotional connection. And it's interesting being so young. You know, I started singing and performing when I was 4 years old. And I remember having really, really overwhelming emotions that I was probably emotionally too young to process, but my body knew that it was something important and it was something big. So what you say in terms of the connection between sound and emotion, it's remarkable to me. It really is.
Very good. Well, yeah, I agree with you. I think that overall the field of the science behind music and the brain is evolving very rapidly recently. But up until recently, we didn't understand exactly what was the mechanisms behind how music can affect brain function. So, you know, we spoke so far about a few of these principles. I think the entrainment that we discussed before with rhythm and gait, the ISO principle, those are very popular ones that music therapists use in their practice. But I wanted to bring to another area that is perhaps a more recent. If we go to the next slide, which has to do with how we can modulate emotions through the induction of this relationship between music and mood, the so-called ISO principle, in a clinical study. And this was published 3-4 years ago. And they introduced different types of songs to patients and individuals, a sad song and a happy song. And they were able to look at emotion responses to the different songs that was pretty immediate, actually. The brain and the chemicals in the brain that actually controls emotions have a direct relationship with what the type of music that we hear. So you can actually now start to measure these responses more from a biological standpoint. Let's go to the next slide, please. So let's dive a little bit deeper and let's go to the next slide and try to talk about certain networks in the brain. And there is a principle that we talk a lot about brain health called the neuronal plasticity. And that's a principle that explains how the brain adapts and changes to internal or external stimulation. And this is a constant state of adaptation. And different things can actually make that process easier or more difficult for the brain. And MS patients, due to the nature of the disease, they're constantly relying on the neuronal plasticity to adapt to lesions, for example, to compensate for inflammation, to compensate for atrophy in the brain. So this is a mechanism that our MS patients rely a lot in order to be able to function despite having, for example, lesions in certain parts of the brain. So the relationship between music and neuroplasticity has been studied recently, and exposure to music, whether formal training musicians or just simply listening to music, has a direct effect on cognitive flexibility, being able to think, being able to adjust to different environments, attention, reward, motivation, and emotional processing. Let's go to the next slide. So this was a very recent study published a month ago, looking at individuals who sing in a choir, and they were able to measure these pathways in the brain that are directly linked to the way the brain processes information. And they actually saw that individuals who sing in a choir has significantly enhanced connectivity in all of these pathways that are critical for cognitive flexibility. So this gives you a sense of how much interest is being recently placed in understanding this relationship between musical exposure and brain connectivity and structural responses in the brain. Let's go to the next slide, please.
I would assume, Dr. Miravalle, that this would also be a correlation of why it is often spoken about for infants to listen to even classical music in their infancy.
Absolutely, and Brittany, I'm glad you brought that classical music, because we're going to talk about that, and which has to do with, does the type of music matters, or music is one thing? Is that, do we really need to listen to Mozart? Put that question on hold. We're going to get there.
Perfect.
But
Thank you.
of course, we know that there are certain chemicals in the brain that are going to impact the way we feel. And we know that cortisol is that stress hormone. And when we feel that our brain is pretty much in that state of anxiety, that's probably a lot of cortisol that has been released. We know that music reduces chronic stress by lowering cortisol levels. And these studies have been done in the ICU, in the intensive care units, and individuals who were in coma, when they were exposed to music, they had significant drop on blood pressure and heart rate. And that's just the only intervention that differs between these individuals and other individuals without music. So we also know that music increases one other neurotransmitter chemical called dopamine. And dopamine is very commonly linked to Parkinson's disease, but it's also, we all have dopamine and we all benefit from dopamine. And it's also known as the motivation molecule in the brain. And music directly increases the levels of dopamine. And the last one is this hormone called oxytocin, which is the lab hormone. And the one that actually we increase when we eat chocolate, for example, or we receive a hug from someone. And of course, music and playing music with others increases the levels of oxytocin. So let's go to the next slide. So a lot of interest has been placed in music and depression, as you can imagine, because all of these hormones play a role in depression. And there are now currently over 25 controlled trials that showed a positive effect between music therapy and levels of anxiety and depression. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just to show you that not only these studies looked at the clinical effect on depression, but also they were able to measure through this study called PET the levels of certain chemicals in the brain, in this case, dopamine, in individuals who were exposed to music. So I'm going to ask you, Brittany, to maybe share some stories or thoughts about how music, perhaps in your journey with MS, helped with mood or with the way you felt about certain situations.
From a very, very young age, Dr. Miravalle, I have had just a really emotional connection with music. I mean, I was 4 and 5 years old. I was performing with my mother, who had a jazz quartet at the time, classically trained pianist. So I was always listening to classical music from infancy and up. And I remember, you know, while I was born in 88, so other kids were listening to, you know, Backstreet Boys. And of course, I love them. Who doesn't? I'm an 80s baby. But I really loved listening to the Celine Dion's and the Whitney Houstons. And there was just something about that powerful, a power ballad, that the way that it was composed and the way that it moves, and it just moved me. And it's very interesting when you were talking about the hippocampus and memory. So standardized memory with me in particular as an MS patient fails me 9 times out of 10. I cannot remember little things. I have a hard time even remembering what I did yesterday. As far as musical memory goes, and this is actually a question that I have for you too, is how on earth, as someone living with multiple sclerosis, do I have such a hard time remembering basic things like what I did yesterday or plans that I have, a few days down the road, but I can remember a repertoire of over 1,000 pieces of music for songs that I haven't even sung or heard in over 25 years. That to this day baffles me. And it baffles my family and my husband as well. He's like, you don't remember what we did yesterday, but you've never heard this song. You haven't heard the song in over 25 years. What is the differentiating factor here with hippocampus as far as standardized memory and musical memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me know if this sound is better. I've been trying to adjust, but there's something called the muscle memory that we usually say, and that's not only in the hippocampus but also in the back of our head called the cerebellum. And there's a video that is so inspirational, that is his patient with Alzheimer's disease, that he can barely recognize his wife, but then he goes to the piano and he plays a song by memory. And
Yes.
so our memories are stored in different places, but any memory that includes movement or singing or playing or performing is going to have that extra storage in the cerebellum that then allows you to have this almost automated retrieval of the song or whatever you're trying to sing.
And my mother can contest to this as well. So her and I, we are recording and performing regularly, but she also performs as a solo pianist for memory care through, I don't even, maybe it's 10 or 10 plus or so Alzheimer units. And she comments and tells me, she'll go to a show and she'll do a performance. And these folks, they're not even sure where they are. But the second she starts playing, she'll hit a song and they're dancing, they're singing along. And then the second the song is over, it's almost like somebody pulls the shade down again.
Exactly. And that's that powerful effect that music has to the entire brain. It's like a workout to the brain, right? Our emotions, our movement, our chemicals, all of that goes into this heightened state of activity. So thank you for sharing that. That speaks to, I think, all of our hearts in terms of how music impacts our entire journey. So let's go to another topic now. If you can go to the next slide, please. Which I think you brought up before. Does the type of music matter? And so even though, and you referred to that before, that Mozart effect that was popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, that the scientists were trying to understand, if we expose babies to classical music, are they going to get a benefit from that? And the answer is yes, they did. But the type of music turns out that is not what is making the difference. It's actually whether you like, enjoy the music or you don't. And this has to do with a pathway of the brain that I would like to discuss today. For some of you, maybe the first time that you're hearing about it, but it's a very important pathway, particularly in multiple sclerosis, something that we call the default mode network. And this network, think of that network as this very large interconnected nuclei in the deep part of the brain that helps kind of restore that state of resting. Unlike most of the networks in the brain, this network is active when we are not doing something, when we are not focusing on something, or when we are not actively thinking about something. So this state of, wandering or daydreaming, or that state of, when we are exposed, let's say you go for a walk and you sit in a bench and you start just thinking about things and you let your brain wander, that's when your default mode network is the most active. Contrary to that, let's say that you're working, you're multitasking, you're trying to send this email and you're answering that phone, well, you're inactivating that default mode network. Let's go to the next slide. And if you can continue to click, because there are some animations here. So these are examples of circumstances in which we activate the default mode network. We talked about the daydreaming, but also when we start planning things. Let's say that you wake up in the morning, you got a cup of coffee, and you start thinking about your day or you're still thinking about your future. We consolidate experiences and we make sense of memories when we are activating this default mode network. Some people will relate to this. Sometimes you go for a walk or a bike ride, and in that process, you get inspired about things more than if you are constantly trying to work in front of your computer. Some people find that joy when listening to music, and all of a sudden you may be thinking that your brain is inactive because you are not actively thinking, but that state of daydreaming and wandering is actually helping consolidate memories. It's helping to also build resilience, helping to build empathy. We also create this sense of situational awareness. And sometimes that happens to all of us when you go to a party and you enter the room, and even though you're not talking or doing much, your brain is capturing all of this information from the outside, and you start thinking, okay, do they like me? Am I in the right place? Am I doing a good job here or not? So all that process is the default mode network. And guess what? When we listen to music, we are activating this network. And why is that important to know? Because this is great in normal circumstances, but sometimes that switch between activating the default mode network during daydreaming and deactivating that during focused attention gets impaired. And that happens a lot in multiple sclerosis patients. And that's why sometimes patients say, well, I try to go to work and I cannot focus. I cannot get my head straight to actually do what I want to do. Or sometimes it's the opposite. I'm thinking too much about my future and then I start to worry about my future. Or then I start to have these recurrent thoughts and worries about things. Or situational awareness becomes unhealthy, and then you start to become paranoid about certain social interactions. So those are symptoms that explains how sometimes it's difficult to deactivate the default mode network. Let's go to the next slide. So in MS, we know that due to inflammation and due to all the things that MS causes in the brain, it might be an inadequate suspension of this network during that switch. And that's something that we can help to train to be able to deactivate the default mode network. But any functions in the brain, if you're using it for too long, then problems occur. So we need to deactivate this network. One of the most effective ways is by using music. So by using music, what we do is we activate the network, and then when we stop listening to music, we help to switch that off again. So one way we can use music in a practical way is saying, well, if I feel that my head is all over the place and I can't concentrate, I can just take a break, go to a quiet room, and listen to a song. And it turns out that actually sad songs are the most effective at manipulating the default mode network. So if you listen to a sad song that you like is even stronger, you're able to kind of like recalibrate that network. And then when you stop listening to the music, you can take a break and try to answer that email or go to that work. So those are examples of how you can take this knowledge about the default mode network and use music to recalibrate that and create that artificial switch between the on and the off. So
it is almost like a reset, isn't it?
Exactly.
It is. It's so funny when you said the sad song thing, I go, gosh, I remember being really, really stressed out about something, and I'll just listen to, you know, a Celine Dion power ballad that's really emotional. And by the end of it, I'm emotionally exhausted because the song was just fantastic and I'm just engulfed in it. But no, it really does feel like an emotional reset.
That's exactly right. That's what we do. We reboot the system. So cool. We create a reset with a sad song. And that way we can say, well, this is a natural stop for the network. Let's move on with our lives. So let's go to the next slide, please. And this is exactly what we were looking at. So they did a study looking at areas that are involved in the default mode network. This is a functional MRI. And they looked at things like sad music, whether you like the music, or dislike the music, or is your favorite music. And long story short, if you listen to a sad song, that is one of your favorite songs, that's the most efficient way to activate and then deactivate this default mode network, create that reset that Brittany mentioned. Let's go to the next slide. Other ways that we can do this is through meditation. So meditation is a very powerful way to control that activity of the default mode network. Let's see another clip, please. And this is animations. So mindfulness is another way to create that reset, as we mentioned before. Let's go to another clip. And so anxiety is one of the consequences of not being able to shut off the network. And if you continue to ruminate, if you continue to think about these fears that we have, these concerns, that's perhaps a manifestation that this network is not being properly controlled. And I think there is another publication that I put here that was in individuals that practice yoga. And yoga is another way to help kind of recalibrate and reset this network. So mindfulness, sad music, music that you like, meditation, yoga. So how is that sounding to you, Brittany?
Fabulous. Sounds like a vacation. And it's so funny too, because as a musician, you know, it's so easy to get kind of pigeonholed into one genre of music. But I think that's the beauty of it, is that when you really allow yourself to expand and appreciate and have, you know, musical and artistic respect for multiple genres, you get to experience so much audibly. You know, I listen to everything from gospel and Elvis to BB King and blues and then pop. You know, what's on the radio now? Well, some of what's on the radio now, that's a whole different webinar and tea time. But you know, I think it's really, really good to expose yourself to a magnitude of genres and options, because you never know what's going to tickle your brain. Pardon the pun.
Absolutely. And then you can play around this principle. So something I've been doing recently is I listen to music when I'm driving. But then, you know, of course, I'm activating my default mode network. But then I want to concentrate on one instrument. So let's say I'm listening to an orchestra. So, okay, I'm only going to listen to the violins and follow that. So what I do then is deactivate the network, because now I'm
You're
paying
isolating
attention to something, right? So that way you can create this training in your own brain to say, well, I'm going to let it go, or I'm going to shut it off.
Yeah.
And that's a very practical way to use music to that benefit.
Yeah, that's amazing that you say that too, because my mother says that all the time. She'll be able to completely isolate. I work as a vocalist, so I'm classically trained vocalist. People get confused. They're like, wait a minute, the tattooed girl sings opera. Yes, everyone, she does. But I primarily, when I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm listening to the lyrics. I'm listening to the emotion behind it and the complexity of where it's going emotionally. She isolates the instrumental, so she can do exactly what you're saying and isolate a specific horn part or a specific bass line. And I'm like, I just want to focus on the lyrics, because I hear everything else and it's moving, and you know, you have that dynamic flow. But that's amazing how you can isolate a specific instrument line like that. It's just amazing. It's so cool.
And what a beautiful workout. I mean, think about it. We are using our brain, we are creating dopamine, we are making our brain happier, and we are improving cognition. At the same time, we are recalibrating these networks in the brain just by using music. And that's just the wonderful message here, is that, you know, we are starting to learn more about the effect of music on the brain, but the more we learn is that there are no side effects. It's actually, unless, you know, you decide to dance and perhaps you fall, but that's on you, right? But it's not the music itself. There is nothing that the music can do wrong to our brains.
Amen. Couldn't agree more.
Very good. Let's go to the next slide, please. I think we are getting to the end. So this has to do with dose, right? So does music follow that traditional dose response? So the more the better. Well, it turns out that it does. So the studies looked at, for example, the brain of musicians compared to healthier brains. And not surprisingly, musicians have bigger, better connected, more sensitive brains. Also, the brains of musicians, particularly those who play keyboard or instruments that require that simultaneous use of the hands, were more symmetrical from a functional standpoint. Musicians have also larger corpus callosum, and that's an important part of the brain for multiple sclerosis. The corpus callosum is that bridge that connects the right to the left, and MS likes to cause lesions there and atrophy. So having more of the development of that area could bring benefit. And as we talked before, musicians also have superior working memory, auditory skills, and cognitive flexibility. Even though we are not musicians for the most part, but we listen to a lot of music, and these studies looked at, for example, more than 32 hours per week, you get similar benefits. So you don't have to be a musician in order to get the benefits. How do you feel about that, Brittany?
I am starting to think that in order for my hippocampus to be activated during standardized memory, I should just turn everything into a song.
Here you go. And that's, yeah.
That's my vote.
Hey, didn't we all learn the ABCs with a song?
Exactly. That's so funny. Oh my gosh, I love it. But no, yeah. I really think that, I mean, when I'm thinking of having, I struggle with cognitive dysfunction horribly. And in the last year, I've noticed that it's gotten significantly worse, but it has not changed at all with my ability to either record, perform, or create music. I always joke and I say that I'm more awkward in life than I am on stage or in a recording studio. It's very, very natural to me. This is weirder, believe it or not. But no, I think that we have to be able to be willing to be creatively explorative and not pigeonhole ourselves and be openly, I guess, vulnerable with learning new things about ourselves in a musical sense. Try different things. You know, maybe you have to have complete silence. Maybe put on meditation music. When I'm really trying to focus on something, if there's lyrics in it, that's where my brain's going to go. So I have to listen to something that is completely instrumental, no lyrics, because it just sort of clouds everything.
I love that. And I really like what you said about listen to your body, right? So sometimes, and that applies to many things in brain health, whether it's exercise or diet. But there are certain things that we actually have to push ourselves a little bit. And I will say with music, I will challenge all of us here to push ourselves to listen to more music. Because it's easy to forget, and or maybe use the music as a background, but perhaps take 10 minutes a day and just listen to good music and just be that the only activity that you have for those 10 minutes. And that's going to have a profound effect in how you feel about it.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, I believe we are coming to the end. There are a few more slides, so if you can go to the next one, please. So we kind of talked about this, so we can skip that one. And these are the highlights. So I think, you know, I hope that I walked you through some of the science behind how music affects both structural and functional changes in the brain. We talked about plasticity, networks, how we can actually modify the default mode network in a way that helps to restore that balance. We also talked about how music affects some of the chemicals, particularly the motivational hormone called dopamine, the lab hormone called oxytocin. We also discussed how music therapy could be used, understanding the ISO principle, understanding the entrainment principle or grounding to help people do this coupling between auditory and motor function or auditory and behavioral responses. And then last but not least, as Brittany mentioned, we can use music for cognitive decline, for memory, to remember things through song, through singing and other ways. So I believe that's the last slide. So we can probably stop the presentation and maybe open the floor for questions or comments from the audience.
Don't be shy. This is a fantastic, fantastic topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miravalle and Brittany. Yes, we are beyond excited. It's been so interesting and we have enjoyed the learning so much. We have received so many questions, and I know some of the topics you addressed, but it's just good to revisit. Questions about the genre. Is there one that is better over the other, especially for MS patients?
Yeah, no, as we discussed, no, they're not. But what it does make a difference is whether you like it or not. So, and the studies that I reviewed, I didn't go into detail, but that activation of these networks in the brain, it's in a sense blunted, or even the opposite, sometimes inhibited if you don't like the music. So you have to listen to something you like. That doesn't mean that has to be always the same. As Brittany mentioned, you can explore different things. You can learn to like something different.
Yeah.
But if you get to that stage of enjoying music, that's when you get the most benefit.
Right. From a listener and as well as a performer. So prior to my diagnosis, we were working with record labels that were very structured of, okay, this is marketable, this is going to sell. And after my diagnosis, we made a complete genre shift that now we only write, produce and perform music that is dedicated to the space of multiple sclerosis, chronic illness, and disability. So you have to enjoy what you're doing in terms of entertaining and performing, as well as enjoying what you're listening to. So try everything. Try everything.
Thank you for that. So we have another question. Instrumental music versus music with lyrics. Is there a difference on the impact on the brain?
So in terms of the impact, no, they both have a benefit. In terms of the parts of the brain that gets activated, of course, anything that includes verbal language is going to have an impact in those places of the brain that includes auditory perception and understanding language. So it is a part of the brain called the Wernicke's area, which is in the temporal lobe. And that's the part that we activate when we try to understand verbal input. So when someone talks to you or when someone is singing a song, you might be activating those areas. But in terms of the benefits, they are both equally beneficial.
And it's funny too, even listening though, sometimes even through instrumental, I can hear words, not like I'm crazy, I hear words, but there's some sort of subtextual undertone in even an instrumental piece where you can hear the alluded emotion that it wants you to feel without there actually being a lyric there. It's really cool.
Thank you. Another question that came in is about music and MRI. Are my brain MRIs different depending on whether I was listening to music or no?
That's a great question. So the studies that I shared with you used a particular sequence on an MRI called functional MRI, which is different to the structural MRIs that we do for clinical care. So in a sense, no, the type of MRIs that we use, it doesn't matter whether you listen to music or not during the MRI. However, if we ever use functional MRIs, you better believe if someone is listening to music or moving, they're going to activate different parts of the brain.
Such an interesting topic, right? So other questions are about more related to the MS symptoms. For someone who has brain fog, cognitive issues, pain, and fatigue, how can I apply music and how does it benefit my MS?
Yeah, so those are very common symptoms. And so one of the ways I look at fatigue is, understanding, is that a fatigue state? Meaning that you wake up and you're really tired and there's nothing you can do to wake you up or to improve that level of energy, or is circumstantial based on the things you did. So in the first case, I will say, well, you need to pay attention to your sleep, you need to pay attention to medications perhaps there are some underlying disorders like thyroid disorders, so many things can affect that fatigue state. In terms of fatigability, which is the other example, saying, I wake up fine, I'm refreshed, but then at 2 p.m. I hit a wall. And that's very common, particularly earlier in MS. I think music would be a fantastic way to help with that because you can create those breaks. And I always say, try to break before you are exhausted. And you can create those breaks in which you're going to stop working or doing whatever you're doing and just spend 10 minutes in a quiet room listening to music. And that way you help to reset, as we were talking before, and use music to kind of like refresh what you are doing and gives you that necessary break.
Thank you, Dr. Miravalle. Our next question is, can you relearn to play the piano after years of an MS diagnosis?
Well, that's a question that is dear to my heart because I was a pianist before I became a physician. And I stopped playing for a long time and then I'm slowly relearning. The pandemic did that for me. And I have to be honest with you, it's not easy, but yes, you can. So the brain, as we were talking before, has that muscle memory that allows you to remember things that you learned early on in life. So I will challenge you to say, yes, try it again. Try to set up expectations in a way that they're enjoyable. Don't try to go from 0 to 100 in one day, but just use music as a therapy. Use perhaps music performance or keyboard performance as another form of physical activity.
Thank you. We have another question, and it says, I used to sing. Now it's hard to harmonize and write my music. Did MS take that away from me?
Brittany, that question is
I
for
have
you.
to say, no, it did not. Doing what I do now, it is absolutely like driving someone else's car. And what I mean when I say that is I mean, I've studied classical voice from the age of 7 years old on. And with MS, it changes daily. Sometimes it changes hourly. We have to be able to listen to our body's cues, listen to what it's saying, listen to those limitations that it may be giving us and say to ourselves, okay, well, how can I navigate around this? Or what can I change? Do I need to redesign my set list? Do I need to limit my time in the studio? Doesn't matter how much training or preparation you have, MS is going to do what MS wants to do. And we have to be able to really chameleonize ourselves around, you know, those hurdles and those obstacles. But from an artistic standpoint, oh my gosh, please do not stop. If it rings true in your heart and in your soul and it moves you, find a way to make it work. Do not say goodbye to the things that you love to do in life. Do not say goodbye to music. I don't plan on stopping ever. However, I need to figure it out. You know, recording sessions are very different now. I used to be able to do 6 to 8 hours. Now I go in maybe 2 hours max. I make sure my engineer is ready to go. And it's a one take wonder sort of thing, because after 2 hours, things can get a little hairy. But if you love it, please figure out a creative way of maintaining it. Don't say goodbye to it.
That's beautiful.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Brittany. Our next question is about walking. Would it help my gait or walk to listen to music at the tempo that allows me to walk at a certain pace with confidence?
Absolutely. So I will say, just to be safer, work with a physical therapist that will allow you to understand what is that safe tempo that looks to you. And that could be different to everyone. But absolutely. So, and you know, we can all relate. Imagine going to the gym and working out in the gym with or without music, or going for a walk, right? So I think music creates that framework, as we were talking before, that grounding that creates that almost artificial sense of where we are supposed to be exercising or moving. So yes, so and creating playlists is a very smart way to also go about physical activity, because you can start with a slow tempo, and as you get a little more comfortable walking and you get into a better pace, you can also increase the tempo, so you can actually push yourself a little bit faster. And the same way, when you're relaxing at the end of that workout, you can bring the tempo down in the playlist. So I will say to everyone here, a homework will be start creating those playlists, right? So look at songs that, you know, I have my morning drive when I go to work, and I listen to the songs in the morning, which is totally different to the songs that I listen at the end of the day, that my brain is full of ideas and I'm tired and emotionally exhausted. So I can't listen to that soft music that I listened in the morning. So you can create those playlists anticipating, you know, certain circumstances, so you can help yourself.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. Does the hippocampus ever fill up? Do we ever hit a point when no additional memories can be saved?
No, and that's the beauty of the brain. And that's one of the biggest mysteries of the brain. The brain is ever changing and evolving, and we can always, it's never too late, it's never too early to modulate the brain function with the things we choose to do in life. And now we know that there are 14 modifiable risk factors for dementia, and those are things we can do, whether it's exercise, education, hearing loss. So all of those things have a profound effect on brain function, and that's through every stage of life.
Do you both have any advice or last words before we wrap up our webinar? Any advice for the audience?
Music is so, so important. Oh my gosh, why am I going to cry? It's that important. It's that important that tears are coming, apparently. No, I just think that there is a profound connection emotionally. Now we know medically, Dr. Miravalle, thank you so, so much for making such profound connections between the neurological relationship between our brains and how it responds to music. I think it is something that is widely underestimated, extremely valuable. Don't think too much of it. You know, there's so many things out there that people can say, well, I need to do it right. It's like, just start somewhere. If you still love to sing and you feel like you can't, just start somewhere, start writing, start banging on a drum set, you know, create that playlist. Don't be afraid of diversity. You know, there is so much I think that music can give to us, and it can feed us, and it can feed our souls.
I don't think I can add anything. That was beautiful. I will just simply say enjoy it, create that safe space, share with others. I think there's a lot of benefit that you get with music, but even better if you are with a group of people enjoying music. So I think music can bring so many benefits that go beyond just simply brain function.
Thank you both. Once again, this was such an engaging and wonderful presentation. It's amazing what music can do to our brain, our health, and our souls. This concludes our webinar. On behalf of MSAA, we want to thank Dr. Miravalle and Brittany for their unwavering support and dedication to the MS community. And to all of you at home, thank you for participating. This program was recorded and will be archived on our MSAA's website in the upcoming weeks. Please take a few minutes to complete the brief survey. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.